they were all in agreement about what we could do for Charlie, what the treatment options were. There was drugs, and there was brain surgery, and you're out of luck. And so it was a while ago, but so Charlie was born March 11th, 1992, and he had a pretty normal first year. And then right around his first birthday, a little before his first birthday, I was actually pushing him in a swing one day, and he kind of threw his arm up in the air and twitched his head a little bit, and I didn't even think much of it. And I asked my wife, Nancy, I said, have you seen anything like that? And she said, yeah, I've seen a bunch of it. So that was the beginning, and we started seeing neurologists. The seizures increased in intensity and in duration. He wound up having seizures in the arms of the chief of pediatric neurology at Boston Children's Hospital, Seattle Children's Hospital, UCLA, LA Children's Hospital. So we tried all the drugs that were available at the time. Charlie had a brain surgery, a horrendous brain surgery, and nothing really stopped his seizures. And we lost hope. We were basically told there is no hope. And one day after the visit, I stopped at the medical library, and as soon as I started researching pediatric epilepsy, one of the first things that came up was a ketogenic diet. And it was kind of shocking to me, because what it said was that about a third of the kids with epilepsy as bad as Charlie who go on a ketogenic diet have their seizures go away. And another third are significantly improved, and for a third it doesn't work. And yet all of these folks we had taken Charlie to see never mentioned a word about diet.
Nutrition information can be so confusing, and as advanced as we are medically and scientifically, the question remains, what food should we eat to achieve good health?
We're in a war for information, and the fallout affects all of us. The media is just going to sell what people are going to buy. And if people knew the truth, they would know what to ask for. My name is Vinny Tortorich, and I've been in the health and fitness game for the better part of 40 years, specializing in weight loss. Over the years, I've seen everything come and go at least 100 times. But as a country, we've only gotten fatter. What should I eat? What pill should I take? Should I take a pill? What about this protein shake? We all know someone who's trying to lose weight, and most of those people don't realize simply losing weight doesn't mean good health. My mother, for instance, she was always on some diet. One week it was the Cambridge diet, the next week it was the Scarsdale diet, the next week it was the cabbage soup diet. But wait a minute, the next week she ate nothing but bananas. Where did that come from? I always wonder about things like 8 8-ounce glasses of water per day. Really? Where did that come from? High blood pressure. You know, a doctor will say, oh, you have high blood pressure, stop drinking coffee. Really? These are all just myths.
The myths have become ingrained in our society far too strongly for people to realize they're myths.
What are some of the health myths we hear every day?
Grains are good for you and fat is bad for you.
Obesity is an energy balance disorder.
Calorie in, calorie out.
Calories in, calories out. As long as you're burning enough calories, you can ingest whatever you want.
That you have to exercise to have better health. Saturated fat is the cause of heart disease.
The low-fat diet is a healthy diet.
We saw fat in the coronary arteries, and that must come from ingested fat.
A growing number of doctors are learning that almost everything we're taught about nutrition is wrong.
And I realized there was this incredible story that we had gotten it pretty much completely upside down and backward on fat.
Believe it or not, the story of how we got to where we are today started in the 1860s with the Seventh-day Adventist Church and a woman named Ellen White. Ellen was a higher up in the church, and she would have these premonitions. And one night she had a dream that God came to her and said that we shouldn't eat anything with a face.
I was taken to another place high above this world, and I heard a voice.
There started modern-day veganism. It really didn't exist before then. There were other religious groups who were more vegetarian. They would eat eggs and dairy and so on and so forth. As a matter of fact, God also told her that coffee and tea were bad, which made no sense because both of those are vegetation. Not long after in our history, there was a man named Helmer Steffensen. He also believed to a certain extent that a vegetable-heavy diet was mandatory for good health. He was an explorer who ended up living with Inuits in Canada in 1906. And in that time and place, he was forced to adopt a new diet due to the lack of options. He made a discovery that will change the way you look at food.
Now this raises the whole question of food then. You yourself must have longed for a green vegetable once in a while.
Well, I did it first.
At first, his preconceived notion is, I'm going to die. There is nothing green here. There is no vegetation. They simply eat fish and drink water.
It was unlike anything that he'd experienced, right? Completely unlike the Western diet. It was probably 70 to 80% fat. The Inuit lived half the year on caribou and half the year on whatever they could fish out of the sea.
For 4.5 months, I lived on literally nothing but fish and water. And at the end of 4.5 months, I was healthier than I'd never been before.
And this is on an exclusive meat diet?
That was exclusive fish in this case.
On this diet, they were perfectly healthy. I mean, Steffensen was somebody from the medical world, and he knew what cancer looked like, he knew what heart disease looked like, and he did not see anyone suffering from ill health in that community. When he came back to the United States, no one believed him, of course. What? People eating nothing but meat and fat? How could that be? They certainly would die.
Dr. Charles Norris, Chief Medical Examiner, does not approve of an all-meat diet. I fail to see why the case of the Eskimo with his strict carnivorous diet should be cited as an example to the white American. The Eskimo has never accomplished anything, and the white man has.
We have a weakness of not learning from the natives, but rather teaching them. You see everything through the colored spectacles of your education you're bringing up.
You know, we go through this whole idea of green good, red bad, Greenpeace. A light turns green, it means go. Eat your greens. Yet, when you look at red, well, red means stop. Blood is red. It doesn't take long for media to pick up on these things, and we don't realize it's happening, but it's happening right in front of us.
It's 10 p.m. Do you know where your children are?
Back to Ellen White and her visions. Ellen was having these premonitions, and all of this was happening. The writings were happening in the mid-1860s. But 10 years earlier, in 1856, a 12-year-old boy came to work with the church. His family was in a church, and that was John Kellogg. John, by the time he was 16, was writing and putting out literature for the church. He would go on to share some of the most bizarre beliefs that Ellen White and the church had, including the idea that masturbation and sex were off-limits.
Excuse me, Ricky.
To stave off these sins of the flesh, you should never eat meat because meat increases sexual desire. Well, this is what eventually led to cornflakes. That's right, cornflakes were created by Seventh-day Adventists to curb sexual desires. He was the guy who figured out something that he termed dextrinization. It's when you cook down grain so much it turns into dextrose, it turns into a sugar. You know, today when you see dextrose in a product, you should run in the opposite direction. It's as bad as seeing high fructose corn syrup. It's used for bacon, it's used in salami. All the luncheon meats that you get includes dextrose nowadays because it gives it a shelf life. It's a way to cure it fast, it's cheap, it's easy to do. So something that John Kellogg started way back in the day has also seeped across to the other side and to the meat industry.
There are two issues. There's always multiple questions. One is if you switch from a standard American diet of processed foods and sugary beverages and, you know, for lack of a better word, we'll call it junk, and switch to a vegan diet with with healthy vegetables and beans and legumes and fruits, you're getting rid of a lot of crap that was probably bad for you, which is the sugar and the highly refined processed foods. You would expect somebody to feel better if they did that. The second question is, if you did that and switched to a whole food diet that was animal food based rather than plant based, would they be healthier?
I have spent aggregated more than 6 years on red meat. That is seal meat, caribou meat, muskox meat, polar bear, grizzly bear, and so on.
The Steffensen diet was considered an all-meat diet. So what he did in 1928 was subjected himself and a friend of his to living in a hospital, being monitored for an entire year, eating nothing but meat, fish, and water, and that became the famous Bellevue study.
The studies on Steffensen, which were intensively made from every clinical angle, started on February the 13th, 1928. Steffensen was tested during the experiment with an excessively high-protein, minimal-fat diet, and as a result became ill.
Steffensen said the only time that he felt ill was when he ate too much lean meat, not accompanied by the fat, but that some thick steaks made him feel better again.
You have to have fat with a lean. Lean and fat together make a perfect diet.
At the end, there were 6 publications that came out of that experiment by different doctors looking at whether or not they got enough vitamins and minerals and everything they could possibly measure, and they were found to be in perfect health.
Excessive meat eating is not only not injurious, Dr. Lieb says, but the experiments tended to show that health was improved, resistance to disease strengthened, and the subjects underwent no variation from normal health.
I wanted to try to dispel from the world the same misconceptions which I had of the Arctic when I went north. I used to think that I was well informed on the Arctic before I went north, but I concluded eventually that out of 10 things that I believed about the Arctic before I went north, about 6 were wrong.
The medical community has been promoting saturated fat as being the bad actor for heart disease, mainly. And that really came from weak science called epidemiology. The experimental evidence that shows that that's actually true has never been done. I mean, for example, you could radio label saturated fat in the food and see if it shows up on the arteries. That's never been done. The entire teaching about saturated fat being bad for the heart is not really founded in good science.
It's not that the information is not out there. I remember early on when I was in college, I had a college professor explain to us that fat was our body's preferred source of energy. Okay, fat is a very good way to have energy. And that same professor a couple of weeks later said, our bodies prefer sugar when we do exercise. Weren't we talking about fat just a couple of weeks ago? Yeah, forget about all that. It's sugar. So the message, even in top universities right here in the United States, are a bunch of mixed messages. Do I think there's a big responsibility for media to do the right thing? Yes, I do. You know, we had 3 big networks, the big 3, ABC, CBS, and NBC. Whatever they told us, we went with. Hell, when I was a kid, there was still even cigarette commercials on the air. At least we figured out that that was a bad idea.
Don't settle for some of the taste, some of the time.
It's very easy to see how someone can think something or just say something and that becomes a reality.
Breakfast. No eggs or fatty meats. Instead, eat grains and fiber that actually lower cholesterol.
How about the term heart-healthy grains? We've all seen it. Many people believe it. After all, the terms come from studies that prove it to be true, right?
Those were studies looking at whole grains versus white processed flours and grains. So of course, when you're comparing it to something like white processed flour, it's going to be better. But does that mean it in and of itself is therefore heart healthy?
You could make the argument that whole grains are less bad for you than refined grains, but that doesn't make whole grains good.
Oatmeal or oat bread or an oat muffin or oat bran that is either incorporated into some other cereal product.
It's like cigarettes. You can have cigarettes with a filter on and they're less bad for you perhaps than unfiltered cigarettes. Doesn't make the filtered cigarettes good. It just means they're less bad. And the same thing is true for whole grains. They are less bad.
We should put more emphasis on our vegetables. We should think about the vegetables we're going to have for dinner rather than the meat portion.
Listen, I'm not a doctor. I'm just a guy with a physical education degree who became a trainer and somehow found myself in the world of modeling. Before I became a trainer to the stars and eventually a best-selling author and podcaster. But when I started modeling in LA in the early 90s, I realized that the media will sell us anything to make a buck, regardless of whether it's healthy or not. Let's face it, every beer commercial you've ever seen is a bunch of ripped up guys on the beach playing volleyball, because that's what beer drinkers look like. If you have ripped up abs or you have a nice set of shoulders, they want you modeling everything in the infomercials. It was the heyday of the infomercials.
If we think fat, then we are.
Fat diets, powders, pills, still my weight's been up and down like a yo-yo until the AIDS plan taught me how to take off weight and help keep it off.
Just 20 minutes a day will turn your body into a calorie-burning furnace.
We were coming into this age of, hey, if you just do what I tell you, you can look like this guy or this woman in just a few weeks.
Dexatrin did it. I lost weight and feel great.
Nobody wanted the truth. They just wanted a lie that they could get everyone to believe.
Now you can lose weight without diets.
No, this product really doesn't work.
Without pills.
No, that product really doesn't work.
Without exercise.
Well, what does work?
Now you can lose weight just by watching television.
So I learned very quickly, be careful as to what you advertise. The 1920s and 30s, it was a lot different. We were learning a lot of things back then. We were discovering vitamins for the first time. We also learned that food could heal. And a lot of these therapies are what were being used to heal people. They were using non-starchy, non-sugary diets to starve cancer in the 1920s and 30s. Take Otto Warburg, for instance. He was doing cancer studies on rats. He thought that the outcome would be that oxygen was what was fueling cancer cells to grow. And what he learned with rats was that it was actually the sugar.
In the healthy cell, glucose is split into carbon dioxide and water. The tumor cell, however, is able to split glucose into lactic acid, and so, in a certain sense, get along without oxygen, and at the same time, obtain the necessary energy from its food. This is true not only in tumor cells separated from the body, but also true of tumors in animals and human beings.
His discovery was well known as the Warburg effect, and it was shown to help in somewhere near 80% of the cases of people who had cancer. Why does it feel like no one knows this information? We were making these discoveries, so what else contributed to them not taking hold? We had a Great Depression, and then we had a war. A lot of people were having trouble putting food in their mouth, period. So I don't think people were caring that much about their health. People were just trying to eat anything. People didn't eat out as much. We made homemade dressings. You didn't have dressings that were full of processed oils, and we weren't adding high fructose corn syrup to everything that we ate. We ate real whole foods that were cooked at home. Even fast food was different back in the 1940s and 50s. If you had French fries, they were made from rendered animal fat, basically beef tallow, which was a better way to cook junk food. So even our junk food was better in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. It wasn't until we got to the 1950s where people started to become more prosperous. We saw the advent of TV dinners and all this stuff, and more sugar, and processed foods came from everywhere. But what really happened in 1955, when one of the most popular presidents of our time, Dwight D. Eisenhower, had a heart attack.
News of President Eisenhower's sudden illness, described by his doctors as coronary thrombosis, came as a severe shock to us all.
Films of President Eisenhower made just before his heart attack
are dramatic evidence of the suddenness of the illness that shocked the nation.
President Eisenhower's heart attack struck at a time when he was close to the zenith of his prestige at home and abroad. It follows that the president's illness is a vital concern to the entire world.
Well, if he could die, what could happen to me?
You have to understand, this is a period in the 1950s when America is in a complete panic about the rising tide of heart disease.
Before that, we never thought about heart attacks. We never thought about health and fitness. We didn't think about the food we were eating. No one back in the 1950s knew what their cholesterol score was, much less even knew what the word cholesterol meant.
Medical textbooks tell us that cholesterol is a white compound, somewhat soapy to the touch, and is distantly related to alcohol.
It is no alien poison to be avoided by man at any cost, but an important element in the body's chemical machinery.
Cholesterol is a kind of a fat-type molecule. It's in all of our cells, 30 trillion cells.
Cholesterol is actually so important to the body that it actually makes the majority of cholesterol that's in your blood right now. Most of the dietary cholesterol you eat will go through you, and very little actually gets absorbed. And of that cholesterol you find in the blood, most of it was made by your liver.
It is an essential of nerve tissue, for instance, and a raw material for the production of several hormones, bile, and a form of vitamin D. It is found naturally in the blood, and also often in the walls of arteries and other blood vessels.
If you eat more cholesterol, your body will make less. If you eat less, your body will make more, which makes it very interesting that it was so maligned in the past few decades.
Heart disease had been rare in the early 1900s and had really risen since the late 1920s to be the #1 killer disease by the 1950s.
We took a collective gasp in this country. We didn't want to have another president die in office.
Just imagine your president not being in the Oval Office for 10 days and he's in bed.
Besides, this guy was very popular. People wanted to find out what caused it. Could it have been his diet? And if so, what was he eating and how can we change it? This is also the time when the media was more prevalent.
Motion picture cameras join newspaper reporters in the old State Department building for an historic presidential press conference. The first ever filmed in sound by newsreel cameramen.
Well, I see we're trying a new experiment this morning. I hope it doesn't prove to be a disturbing influence.
The power of media. You can't really tell that story without telling the story of Oprah Winfrey. It was 1993, and by happenstance, I was put up for an appearance on Oprah. They needed someone the next day. They were looking for younger men who were dating older women. And since my girlfriend was 7 years older at the time, I was invited on. I wasn't into it. I had no idea what really happened on Oprah. But I was told, no, you have to do it. It'll be great for your career. So they fly me to Chicago, and I get to the green room. I was introduced to a woman named Doe. The theme of the show was younger men who were dating older women.
Older women having the courage to live their dreams and fulfill their fantasies and live their lives exactly the way they wanted to, including dating younger men.
Doe said that I would have to pretend that I was dating her. And I said, what are you talking about?
My guests today, they're all members of a provocative new kind of dating service.
I told her that I would not go on stage and lie. I would go on stage and sit next to Doe, but I would not say that we dated. I quickly realized that I'd been bamboozled because Doe introduced me as her boyfriend.
I'd like you to meet Vinny Tortorich. He's a Beverly Hills fitness expert. He's hot, sweet, he loves women, and he's emotionally accessible.
Get out of here.
I couldn't believe what was happening. And at that moment, I said to myself, I'm going to turn this into not the Oprah show, but the Vinny show.
Number one, women don't even hit their sexual prime until they hit 40. They don't even know what's going on until they're 40. I've been dating older women.
Gee, I'm only 39.
I'm going to make this show so bad that they won't possibly be able to run it on national television.
You want to be with an older woman. It's the difference between riding in a Volkswagen and a Cadillac. If you want to ride in a Volkswagen, go right ahead. If you want the Cadillac, go for the older woman.
Well, now.
It turns into a circus. The people in the audience actually believed all this. Doe and I had just met. It was like the audience was participating in this huge game of Mad Libs.
Two different generations. How was school? Oh, I learned arithmetic. I don't see how two people can have something in common if they're not the same age.
It seems like people are treating this like some sort of fetish.
What could you possibly have in common?
Let's say Cher walked into the room and said she had to have you. Sally, get Cher on the phone.
I ended up asking Cher out on a date during the show.
Cher is on the phone.
Cher, my name is Vinnie Tortorich, and I want to say this in front of the whole country. Is the camera on me?
Yeah, camera's on.
Cher, I live in Beverly Hills. Let's get together and have lunch. I'll have my agent call your agent, and we'll do it because we'll have a great time. No matter how outlandish I got, they seem to enjoy it more and more.
What I want to know is from the ladies in the audience, should I have lunch with this guy?
As a matter of fact, you can see Oprah. Oprah started dancing in the aisles. The show ended, and I went back to L.A., and I just assumed, well, that show's going to bomb. As of last year, it was the 7th highest-rated show in Oprah's history. People still recognize me for it today, and virtually none of it was true. I took that realization that media can change everything. Eisenhower has a heart attack, and he wants the whole country to know that this was a real issue.
I am happy the doctors have given me at least a parole, if not a pardon, and I expect to be back at my accustomed duties, although they say I must ease my way into them and not bulldoze my way into them.
But the media had other ideas. They have their own agenda. He had the common cold of heart attacks. He didn't really have a bad one. The media was trying to show him on the golf course, having a great round of golf.
It was thought that diet was the cause. He was also like a 4-pack a day smoker, which may very well have given him his heart attack.
Yes, according to this survey, more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette. Try Camels yourself.
Right around that time enters Ancel Keys.
Ancel Keys was a pathologist at the University of Minnesota. He got the idea in the 1950s that saturated fat and cholesterol were what caused heart disease.
It strikes without warning. Of 10 men, we can expect 5 to get it. But we can't say who, or when, or why.
Ancel Keys was this incredibly persuasive person. He had a really outsized belief in his own ideas.
The facts are simple. You know the chief killer of Americans is cardiovascular disease, disorders and degeneration of the heart and blood vessels. Here are vital statistics. They show that this problem here in America is the worst in the world.
Ancel Keys was famous for something called the 7-country study. This is where he went and studied 7 different countries and came up with this hypothesis as to how we're supposed to eat based on correlation.
Ancel Keys is the one who proposed what he called the diet heart hypothesis, and that was that saturated fat and cholesterol, dietary cholesterol, would give you a heart attack, especially saturated fat, like hot oil down a cold stovepipe. It would just clog up your arteries and give you a heart attack.
The problem is he cherry-picked these countries to fit what he was trying to hypothesize. It set out to prove that the more calories you got from fat, the better chance you had of getting heart disease. It seemed like a straight line between the least fat consumed and the most fat consumed, with the U.S. at the top. The only problem is Keys studied 22 countries. And if you factor in all of those countries, the results were all over the place. He just took the 7 countries that proved this point, that fat causes heart disease. This study made Keys the temporary savior of the medical community, and therefore the world.
Such that he was able to get onto the American Heart Association Nutrition Committee, and he turned the whole association around in 1 year and got them in 1961 to recommend that all Americans restrict saturated fat and cholesterol in their diets in order to fight heart disease.
Dietary fat and its relation to heart attacks and strokes. Most persons in the United States who are overweight will find it profitable to reduce their total caloric intake. Reducing the amount of fat in the diet is one way to do this.
This is the first advice anywhere in the world telling people not to eat saturated fat and cholesterol to fight heart attacks. That's like the beginning of it all. That is what just blossomed, bloomed, grew into the giant oak tree of advice that we have now.
We have no credible evidence to say that saturated fat causes heart disease. And that sounds crazy to say when you look at our government guidelines and our dietary guidelines, but there is no high-level, credible evidence to show that saturated fat causes heart disease.
The interesting thing about Keys, he got virtually everything wrong, but it never infected his humility.
We live in a time right now when we've had a narcissistic turn. People are very primitive and narcissistic, a lot of injuries in childhood, and it has caused us to perhaps not have the most secure sense of self and identity. People attach themselves to one particular approach to diet, and it develops into an identity around which people maintain a religious intensity. They defend it as though any question in their dogma is like you're questioning their religious dogma or threatening their very sense of the fabric of reality. And so we start looking around for things to attach ourselves to, and political groups, religious organizations, different diet fads, we attach ourselves to these groups, and we look to the groups for our identity. So our going forward in life is somehow threatened by somebody saying, hey, maybe fat's not so bad for you. It's positively comedic, but it's becoming ridiculous.
In the United States, coronary heart disease is so common that all one has to do to study the complete natural history of the disease is to take a sample of men, any sample of men that are now healthy, follow them, wait a little while, and a lot of them will have coronary heart disease.
Well, it wasn't very long before it appeared that there was some connection between coronary heart disease and cholesterol in the blood.
No question, we hear over and over and over again that cholesterol equals mortality. We've seen it in the commercials.
Fleischmann's margarine. It's the only leading margarine made from 100% corn oil. It has no cholesterol.
We've heard about it from our doctor.
Over time, they build up on the walls of veins and arteries, helping to clog them, restricting blood flow. It's what causes heart attacks and strokes.
We've heard about it plenty of times from our friends and our family. And because of that, we tend to think it's just simply the truth. It certainly has the degree of repetition that we would expect.
In the 60s and 70s, we were focusing more on the specific types of cholesterol, LDL and HDL. And LDL became known as the bad cholesterol. And all of a sudden, medicine was focused on LDL.
It was noticed that higher cholesterol in the blood appeared to correlate or track with higher heart disease rates.
Cholesterol is carried in the blood by proteins called low-density lipoproteins, or LDLs. The more cholesterol we eat, the more the number of LDLs, and that's dangerous.
So essentially the idea was developed that the higher cholesterol was getting into your arteries and was causing arterial disease.
Because the higher that lipoprotein level goes, the greater the risk of heart disease.
There are some studies that show a correlation. Does that mean causation? And this is a very important differentiation that is too infrequently made. Because something is correlated doesn't mean it is the cause. So if high cholesterol is present in people who are having heart disease, we have to look a little further as to why that is and if there are other factors. When you really look at the studies and you crunch the data, LDL is not the best marker for heart disease. What's even more powerful are your ratios. So whether it's your total cholesterol to HDL ratio or your triglyceride to HDL ratio, those have better predictive value than LDL itself.
The ratios indicate your level of insulin sensitivity or insulin resistance. So the best cholesterol measures are not actually even talking about a cholesterol thing. They are indirectly talking about insulin resistance and health.
A lot of the fat research, look, we saw fat in the coronary arteries and we thought that fat must be coming from somewhere. It must come from circulating fat and that must come from ingested fat. It was a very simplistic kind of idea.
The contrary opinion, the alternative hypotheses, which has been around for a couple hundred years, is that we get fat because we eat carbohydrates like pasta, potatoes, bread. They used to be called simple carbohydrates. Now the terminology is changing to adjust to the fact that a lot of people think maybe these starches, as my mother called them, are not quite so good for us. We focused in just by timing and bad luck on this idea that saturated fat causes heart disease. And we bought into it even though the evidence ultimately didn't really support it. And we made everything else we believed about diet have to be reconciled with that.
Dr. Keys' singling out of excessive consumption of fats as a major factor in coronary disease is by no means accepted by all investigators.
In front of us, day by day, are increasingly more and more very tempting foods.
In the mid-1960s, John Yudkin comes on the scene. He's a British scientist. He thinks sugar's the problem.
When people have heart disease, they don't just have elevated cholesterol. In fact, they often don't have elevated cholesterol. They have a whole cluster of metabolic abnormalities. 10, 15, 20 things you could measure. And Yudkin was saying, if I feed animals sugar or I feed college students that I'm using in my experiments sugar, I could cause pretty much all of these things just by giving them a lot of sugar.
See, up to, say, 200 or 300 years ago, the average consumption of sugar in this country was about 4 pounds a year. And that's splendid. I'd be very happy if everybody ate 4 pounds of sugar a year. They eat 100 pounds.
Comparative studies of the diet of 41 nations have convinced Professor Yudkin that there is an almost exact relationship between the consumption of fat and sugar.
Moreover, many sugar-containing foods, cakes, candies, cookies, chocolate, ice cream, various kinds of puddings also contain fat.
You always eat some fat. So if you eat high-carb foods, you raise your blood glucose, you raise your fat-storing hormone insulin, and you're going to store the fat that you eat. It's all individual how much you can tolerate, but if you eat more than your body can tolerate, then you will most likely gain weight, gain fat.
Drawing the analogy of the relationship between diabetes and national sugar intakes that could statistically also be related to the fat intake, Professor Yudkin considers that heart disease may well be causally related to the consumption of sugar.
And instead of looking at it, Ancel Keys just jumps right on top of it in the media and turns this guy into a nut job.
Keys was really a bully when it came to trying to quash anybody who opposed him.
Ancel Keys wasn't going to let anyone come in and rain on his parade.
He published a 9-page rebuttal in a journal called Atherosclerosis in print. He said Yudkin is a mountain of nonsense.
It is clear that Yudkin has no theoretical basis or experimental evidence to support his claim for a major influence of dietary sucrose in the etiology of heart disease.
Keys and his colleagues managed to paint Yudkin as a quack and to portray Yudkin and his sugar theory as quackery and to say there was absolutely no evidence to support it.
None of what is said here should be taken to mean approval of the common level of sucrose in many diets.
Keys was had more political influence and more savvy maybe than Yudkin, and somehow this dietary, and we were spending money testing the dietary fat hypothesis, so even though the tests weren't confirming it, the more money they spent, the more people were wedded to the hypothesis having to be right.
These studies are extremely expensive, and there have been enough good studies done to support our moderate approach, which is looking at balanced foods, vegetables, fruits, grains, and lean meat and dairy products.
The argument, once again, is it has to be tested. When you believe it's wrong, prima facie, you're not going to spend the money to test it.
Why are these nutrition scientists just not more curious about other ideas? You know, I was at a conference recently where we talked about a low-carb study where they reversed the diagnosis of diabetes it was a large university-based study, in just 1 year on a very low-carb diet. And not one of them said, wait, what? Diabetes reversal? Wow, how'd you do that? Can you just explain your study a little bit to us? Because that's what we, as nutrition experts, we really need to do in America. And I actually got up to ask a question from the audience. I said, you know, did you hear that? That was 60% reversal of diabetes. Should that not be headline news? And should you not be curious? Why are you not even curious about these ideas?
You know, it makes you think of stories like the McKenzie family, parents in South Dakota who realized they had to take matters into their own hands when their son lost 5 pounds in 5 days.
I called the doctor that morning and I explained that I thought my son had rapidly lost weight and something was wrong. And we knew within 5 minutes of him doing a urinalysis test that there was sugar in his urine. And we were escorted to the hospital to learn how to manage our new life.
We both concluded that we were going to make drastic changes in our diet, reducing carbohydrate intake. Shortly thereafter, we were told that we didn't need to do that we could feed our son, recently diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, whatever he wanted to eat.
Take a look. Oh, okay. I'm trusting these people who are now in charge of caring for my son, and they're telling me, give him pancakes and give him French fries and cupcakes and pizza, because now that your kid has this disease, his life is pretty crummy already. And the worst thing you could do as a parent is to try and change his food. I fed my kid the exact prescribed amount of carbohydrates. I pre-bolused his insulin. I put a continuous glucose monitor on him. I bought him a diabetes alert dog. I literally did everything in my own capacity to follow the guidelines and manage his disease, and I failed miserably.
Riv, do you want the yogurt, the tablets, or the gel?
I put a big message out in the social media groups that I'm connected to in the diabetes community, and I asked, how are you people achieving normal blood sugars? What are you doing? And about every 5th answer I got was that these people were changing their children's diet and implementing a very, very low-carb diet. We removed all the processed carbs, the flour, the sugar, the grains, the fruit, anything that would spike his blood sugar. And so the next appointment we had with our endocrinologist, I skipped in there like I had won the lottery. Oh my goodness, I stumbled upon a low-carb diet and look at my son's blood sugars. And during that appointment, our very kind-hearted doctor looked at me and told me my son was going to resent me for the rest of his life, that this way of eating is not sustainable, that I'm subjecting my son to an eating disorder, and he also handed me a business card to go see a therapist because he thought maybe I was struggling with some things and had some issues for wanting to do this for my son and to change his diet. And I'm told to follow these guidelines because without those carbohydrates, my child won't grow properly and his brain function will be compromised. So when you're a parent of a type 1 and you're told the American Diabetes Association, this large governing body that must know exactly what we're up against, they're recommending this, that's intimidating.
We either had to either make a change or accept mediocre care. I'm an orthopedic surgeon. It seems now as if it's the patients that are trying to make the medical community aware of what they already know, of what the patients know, because they have tried to follow the rules as given to them and they failed. When somebody comes to me with a belief that they tell me, I believe your son is going to do better if you feed them more carbohydrates, I know they're wrong. And when it comes to my son, I'm going to do what I know as opposed to what they believe.
Our son went from taking 45 to 50 units of insulin every day to maybe 15 units of insulin.
If you extrapolate that over every child with this disease, you can understand that that's going to have a marked effect on the profitability of the disease.
I think we underestimate people's ability to make a change. And I think if there were doctors and nurses and dietitians who are willing to give patients that option, I think the face of diabetes would be different.
We're a very weird culture because we have an endless amount of energy to talk about almost everything. But when it comes to the core issues and the ones that just affect everything, such as family or such as diet, we have, we just went through an election. We talked about everything, but no one ever talked about diet or family or any of this stuff.
Now you have kids with type 2 diabetes. You have fatty liver disease. You have sleep apnea. None of this stuff existed before. And if you think it's just old people using this, it's getting younger and younger and younger.
It's an epidemic. And it's one of those things like, hey, powers that be, hey, folks in charge, this is going to break the bank.
How do people scream all day about Medicare and this doesn't come up?
Never comes up.
Because it's not sexy. Voted. It doesn't work.
No, you want votes? Telling people like hard news, like, hey, Mom, you're poisoning your kid. Get your shit together. No votes for you.
The current recommendations, it started in the late 60s in response to a documentary that aired on CBS News called Hunger in America.
This spring, a private agency, the Citizens Board of Inquiry, released an exhaustive report claiming that serious hunger exists many places in the United States. Out of a total population of 200 million, the report states, 30 million Americans are impoverished, with family income below $3,000 a year. 5 million of these people are helped by 2 existing federal food programs. Now, a new figure must be added. Of the 30 million who are impoverished, 10 million Americans, whether or not they are reached by federal aid, are hungry. The federal food program might be better administered by the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, or by a special commission whose only concern would be to see that hungry Americans are fed.
This leads right to 1968 in the McGovern Committee. Public calls to address the issue of hunger had been building ever since Robert F. Kennedy had toured the devastated slums of Mississippi.
It's obviously as great a poverty as we've had, and they're going to lead a very difficult, unhappy life through the rest of their existence.
But it was George McGovern, the senator from South Dakota, who would head a committee that started in 1968. Privy to the poverty that the nation was now aware of, the former director of Food for Peace in JFK's administration was intent on bringing change that would eventually affect all of us.
It's always bothered me to see hungry people in the world. I like to eat.
If we are to save ourselves in this country, it seems to me that a radical restructuring of our policies and priorities is absolutely necessary.
There is nothing more to say, really. Senator Kennedy died at 1:44 this evening.
We've got to draw the line at violence, so I have mixed emotions. I'm supporting the president as he tries to bring this war to a close.
It was quite sad, really, to break up with the Beatles, because to see it just fall apart was sad.
We have a mystery story out of Washington. 5 people have been arrested and charged with breaking into the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee in the middle of the night.
When you think of 1972, 1973, we're still in Vietnam. It's not a popular war. Then 1972 comes around and we have Watergate.
People have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
People were just in a haze about diet. No one was really paying attention to this McGovern committee. You know, we had bigger problems. This complacency at the time is what allowed these health myths to seep in.
As you know, I represent all sorts of delicious things. Greasy bacon, potato chips, French fried potatoes, fatty meat, and gobs of butter on everything. Now, as you know, us fat separately are just little guys. But put us all together, and what do you have?
You have millions of calories, that's what. I have to store those calories as fat, and I can't take it anymore. I'm getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
And the bigger he gets, the harder his heart cells have to work. Mr. Fat, you're a real killer.
You know, I don't know the answer, but why is it whenever a new study comes out, it's always talking about how food is going to kill you? I think that's a major misdirection to what we should be focused on. Food should be used to prevent illness, not to just help reverse it once it's too late. One of the areas we haven't talked about until recently is how food can affect your brain health.
I became interested in mental health and the connection between mental health and diet after I had developed a lot of my own health problems and had changed my diet and discovered that diet had a lot more to do with health and mental health than I had ever been taught that it had. In my early 40s, about 10 years ago, I developed a number of mysterious symptoms that I think a lot of people, especially middle-aged women, will identify with. So things like chronic pain, fibromyalgia, IBS, chronic fatigue, migraines, lots of different symptoms that all of my very smart Harvard-affiliated doctors couldn't help me with. After about 6 months of trial and error, I arrived at this diet that was completely upside down from what I had been taught was good for me. It was basically a mostly meat diet, high in meat and fat and cholesterol. And when I arrived at that diet, all of the symptoms that I'd been struggling with completely went away. And I thought, you know, this diet actually is also improving my mental health, and I'm a psychiatrist. The most powerful way to change your brain chemistry would be through food, because that's where brain chemicals come from in the first place. If you're getting most of your sugar and most of your glucose from the outside of the body, you run the risk of getting spikes, peaks and troughs in your blood sugar and insulin level, and those can destabilize brain chemistry. So those can create mood swings, insomnia, irritability, changes in appetite throughout the course of the day. When you eat a ketogenic diet, you're using fat primarily for energy, and the brain is using, to a large extent, ketones instead of glucose.
Today, if you're anywhere near Google, you will learn that this is known as dietary ketosis.
Most healthcare professionals are familiar with ketoacidosis, and that's a state where the body is out of control. Diabetes is out of control. Blood glucose is through the roof. Insulin is not able to keep up with this glucose derangement, and so that's a life-threatening state when you're type 2 diabetic out of control. Nutritional ketosis is quite a different scenario. Blood sugars are absolutely under control. The patient is healthy in every single way. Electrolytes, insulin, glucose, perfectly controlled. We have now trained the body to switch over from burning carbohydrate as the primary fuel. Now the individual becomes fat adapted, and they use fat as the primary source of energy, and that's really the difference between a very unhealthy and a very healthy state.
We had a scientific question in the 1960s where the researchers asked the wrong question, but there were questions we needed answered.
We know that the way you gain weight is you take in more calories than you burn. And those calories can be fat or they can be carbohydrate.
And so they get this hypothesis, which sounds reasonable, that fat people get fat because they accumulate a little bit of extra calories every day. And we could get back to this by not asking how much extra calories. They don't have to really confront the problems with the hypothesis. And that becomes a theory ever since. The history of science, once again, is full of commonsensical facts that turned out to be dead wrong when we did the science. You're certain, you use words like "it proves." When you look at the data, it either isn't there or we just didn't do the experiment.
Speaking of experiments, here's a timeline of events that happened with the McGovern Committee. After a year of fighting for funding, the committee operations began in 1969. There were Democrats and Republicans, including future presidential candidates George McGovern, Walter Mondale, and Bob Dole. The initial goals of the committee centered around hunger and malnutrition, and this led to the legislation in 1970 with principles of free food stamps and nationwide standards for eligibility. It was in 1971 that the committee expanded to focus on eating habits in poor neighborhoods. But in 1972, this extremely pressing issue was put on hold so that McGovern can run for president. When he lost 49 states to Richard Nixon, who would eventually resign and be replaced by this guy, it was back to fixing America's health.
In 1973, the Senate Select Committee on Nutrition and Human Needs began to hold hearings on the American diet and heard dozens of eminent doctors and scientists linking cholesterol to heart disease.
Unfortunately, dietary guidelines were based on the singular focus to lower cholesterol. While we're treating heart disease by supposedly lowering bad cholesterol, we're going to help people lose weight.
If you tell a public of 215 million people what they're eating is going to kill them, they're going to probably listen. And the unintended consequence is that someone is going to step in and take advantage of these people when it doesn't work, right?
Coincidentally, drug companies were spending millions of dollars developing drugs to target LDL.
In the 80s and 90s, a class of drugs was invented called the statins, and these drugs did lower the cholesterol very effectively, and they also were shown to lower heart disease rates.
But the question that's probably more interesting to me, that I think should be more interesting to you, is does it help you live longer?
It might reduce heart attacks by 20 or 30% at best, and it doesn't really reduce mortality much.
We like simple answers that we have treatments for, but that's not where the best evaluation and treatment for heart disease is.
It's absolutely amazing to me the trajectory of statins and low-fat diets with everything we have today stemmed from a committee that was focused on poverty and people who weren't getting enough to eat. And somehow cholesterol got into the mix thanks to Ancel Keys. And in a complete U-turn, in 1974, they expanded the committee to focus on overnutrition.
The very recommendations made led to people eating way too much of the wrong kind of food. So now we have just the opposite problem. We don't have a hunger problem, we have an obesity epidemic.
The Senate committee finally issued a set of dietary goals in December 1977. The McGovern Committee issued a set of nutritional guidelines for all Americans, intended to battle heart disease, cancers, strokes, high blood pressure, obesity. In the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, they recommend fewer calories, less fat, less saturated fat, less cholesterol, more polyunsaturated fat.
All in favor of nominating vegetable oils, say aye.
Less sugar, less salt, more fiber, more starchy food.
The committee's original report urged Americans to reduce their risk of heart attacks by reducing their intake of cholesterol down to the equivalent of about 1 egg a day.
This great experiment we were doing with tax dollars seemed to have one idea repeated over and over. Cholesterol is bad, cholesterol is bad, on its own or in conjunction with other things.
One way to look at it is that saturated fats are healthy when you're not eating carbohydrates, or that saturated fat was never unhealthy all along, but that gets you into the realm of you're telling people that what they've believed is wrong.
As time has gone on, both doctors and private citizens have done their own experiments.
As a software engineer, I look a lot at networks. Networks are basically objects talking to each other. And a lot of understanding a network is kind of like understanding a brain. No one cell in the brain controls your whole body. That actually cholesterol was part of a larger network of objects and how it is that they can move about to provide us what we need.
Another thing we don't talk about is how complicated the human body is. For the government to even recommend what you should be eating in the first place is one thing, but for them to do it in such a simplistic way is another. You know, there were certain scientists that had some hypotheses, and they said, well, some of the stuff we're looking at is leaning towards red meat might be bad for your heart. The commission would say, well, what do you think?
Doctors took issue with that at the hearing, saying that 8 studies involving 5,000 patients failed to show hard medical evidence that diet has anything to do with heart attacks.
I have pleaded in my report and will plead again orally here for more research on the problem before we make announcements to the American public.
Yes, before you make announcements to the public, you should have data that proves what you're saying. Maybe like Dave Feldman did.
My story is a bit interesting. I found that I could move my cholesterol up and down with the dietary fat that I ate. So the more fat I ate, the lower my LDL-C. The less fat I ate, the higher my LDL-C.
On a 3-day diet of over 5,000 calories and 450 grams of fat, he lowered every marker of cholesterol.
I eventually got a number of other people to replicate this. The success rate is somewhere around 85% of those people went on a low-carb, high-fat diet, fatty cheeses, fatty meats, fatty nuts. And in doing so, even though their calories increased substantially, even though their saturated fat just jumped through the roof, their LDL-C and their total cholesterol plummeted. It's very unintuitive, but sure enough, the more fat they would eat, the lower their LDL-C.
Dave Feldman is not a doctor at all. This guy took all of the science that was available and figured it out. Yet members of a publicly funded committee took 10 years to find nothing. And when they were pressured to change recommendations with no science to back it up, they ran around in circles for a while and came out with the same report, but this time they said, oh, you can have some meat and some salt.
I would only argue that senators don't have the luxury that a research scientist does of waiting until every last shred of evidence is in.
So there you have it, the national advice that everything you see today is based on.
That report was then taken over to become official government policy. So it went over to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and by 1980, they came out with the policy, which was the Dietary Guidelines for all Americans. I think it's audacious that the government, based on very weak evidence, should tell Americans what to eat, a healthy population at the time.
How do you tell some guy from the Midwest who's been living on beef his entire life to start eating vegetables? Especially at that time, you couldn't get them year-round. You couldn't get fruit year-round. It wasn't like it is today where we refrigerate and ship fruits and vegetables around the world. You're telling people from different parts of the United States what to do, how to do it, and everyone's just throwing their hands up going, I'm going to do the best I can. Do I think the government was complicit in causing this problem? Yes. Do I think they meant to do it? Absolutely not. I think McGovern's heart was in the right place. They just went the wrong way about it.
But we went on that experiment, and the government put us on that experiment. They didn't ask us about it. They didn't ask our advice. They just told us how to eat, and they told the food industry, asked the food industry to produce low-fat food products.
Industry slowly is responding to it, producing foods that are lower in salt and fat and so on, and people are beginning to get the message.
Low cholesterol, no cholesterol, lowers cholesterol.
Good fat, bad fat, low fat, non-fat.
Milk suddenly came in, you know, bewildering number of varieties, all of them reduced in fat. And whether or not it was a result of the experiment, this coincided with the obesity, explosions in obesity and diabetes we've been seeing today.
The 1980s brought in all sorts of brand new foods.
There's a Dannon body in everybody. Unlike some yogurts, it's low in fat.
The whole thought pattern was, if you didn't eat fat, you couldn't get fat.
Not having fat does not automatically make something a health food, and that's where we get into this debate about, is it just calories in, calories out? Does it not matter what we eat as long as we're burning enough calories to burn it off?
And we still didn't know if eating a low-fat diet was a good thing. It was some of the smartest scientists and the president of the National Academy of Sciences in the late 1970s called this a huge experiment in which the American public were the subjects.
The American has an infinite number of combination of choices with which he can constitute a healthy diet.
Unfortunately, he also has an infinite number of combinations from which he can choose an unbalanced diet.
Let's examine why there is so much confusion about good nutrition. One reason is that we have been given a lot of misinformation, usually by those looking to make a profit. Today, there are still many unusual ideas as to what we should eat. People tend to believe that just because it's in print or on television, it must be true.
The 80s also brought in all sorts of new fitness trends.
Make the commitment now and watch how fast you see results. Are you ready to do the workout?
We couldn't get enough of fitness in the 1980s, but although we were doing all of this, we weren't getting any thinner.
Our sugar consumption increases in part with the introduction of high fructose corn syrup, and that's an unintended consequence of these government actions. It's arguably the case if they had done nothing, we wouldn't have had this epidemic. We might have had it anyway, but they probably or almost assuredly made it worse. For 25 years, we've been pushing a low-fat dogma. It said, eat less fat. First it said, eat less total fat, and you'll have less heart disease, less cancer, and you'll weigh less. Then
that's not exactly true. This started because there's incontrovertible evidence that saturated fat is bad, and that is well established in long-term trials.
You build up in a community, institutions, organizations, everybody collects to them people who think just like they do. Like, we like each other, we respect each other because we think alike. You know, I know nothing about you other than that you think like I do, so I respect the way you think. And institutions do this. And then somebody else comes along from the outside and says, oh, you guys all got it wrong. And look, here's the evidence. All these obese, diabetic people are neck deep in obesity and diabetes. We got to change everything. It's hard to accept. It's hard to back out of. There's no way to back out of it that doesn't destroy your credibility.
In this country, we have freedom of choice to say what we want to say. We have freedom of choice to print what we want to print. We have freedom of choice to think what we want to think, but we do not have freedom of choice for our own health care. Why? I guess profit and politics and power. The MDs and nutritionists and all people need to work together for the total benefit of this country's health.
So in 1992, we did the most brilliant thing we've ever done as a country. We started the food pyramid. Now, this is so ridiculous that I can't even ever remember, because in my own mind, it makes no sense. I always have to read it off of a piece of paper. The pyramid, at the base, the biggest part was bread, cereal, and rice. 6 to 11 servings, not per week, hang on folks, per day. If you went to the maximum vegetables, that's 5 vegetables a day, 5 servings. And fruit, if you went to the max, that's 4. That's 20 servings of carbohydrates every day. And then when you get into milk and dairy, milk has carbohydrates, there's lactose in milk. That's like drinking sugar. And on meat, the most you can have in any given day is 3 servings. Now it gets even worse because we start wondering this, what's a serving? What's a serving of meat? They didn't tell you how many ounces. Well, I can tell you it was 2 to 3 ounces per serving, but who knew that?
You gotta eat the right stuff. Start with a little meat, a little dairy. You gotta add a bunch of fruit.
You have Timon and Pumbaa telling people to eat more grains.
Bread, cereal, rice, noodles.
And eat a whole lot less fat. And if you thought that was ridiculous, the servings that they did give us with the food pyramid did not match what the government told us that servings should be on the packages of food. Those servings, which were also mandated by the government, were completely different from the servings that we heard about when it came to what was on the pyramid.
The new food label represents nothing less than a major victory for the consumer and for the public health.
When you're given a percentage and you see that this is 50% or this is 10% of your expected daily total, then you know very quickly that this food either contributes a lot of fat or a little bit of fat, and how to plan the rest of your diet around this particular food.
This food label, which will be on virtually all foods, will be a benchmark for nutrition information well into the 21st century.
The government makes the manufacturers put the product ingredient list in the amount in which it appears on the package. If the number one thing in it is grains, you will see rice first. If the second thing is sugar, you will see sugar second. These companies got really smart at some point and figured out, hey, wait a minute, we can't do it this way because people are seeing sugar, 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 sugar. So what they do is they name the sugars other things. At last count, we were at 70 names, 70 different names for sugar on packages. Let's say you're diabetic, type 1, type 2, it doesn't matter. If you don't know how to read these labels, your life hangs in a balance. This is the world we live in. This is our society, this is our community. And if we don't fix it, who will? No one will.
The food label has become a veritable minefield of misleading and downright false claims.
And many in Congress feel the same way. They're concerned that any confusion over the truthfulness of health claims could be dangerous because the potential benefit of displaying important health information on food labels would be lost if consumers lose confidence in what they're being told.
When I was a kid in the late 70s, the term metabolic syndrome did not exist at all. Metabolic syndrome is not one thing, it's several things. It's fatty liver disease, it's type 2 diabetes, something else that barely existed in the 70s. We have people on statins and metformin. None of this existed in this quantity in the 70s. We've gone from here to here in just a few short years.
So the same foods that my mother's generation grew up believing would go right to their hips. You know, by the 1980s, we were being told to eat 6 to 11 servings per day. They were the base of the food guide pyramid in the 1990s, and they coincided with this obesity epidemic. I mean, we couldn't have screwed up the science of obesity more if we had tried.
We don't know what to do. Nutrition experts, the establishment, the orthodoxy just doesn't know what to do. So they continue raising money for the American Heart Association, the American Diabetes Association, but they don't have any new ideas. They keep saying, just keep applying the advice that we've given you, and somehow it'll turn out different this time. One of the things that I always say is, why not just be open to new ideas? Like, here's some other ideas coming along. Let's just consider them. Don't we have an obligation to the public to consider, at least, other ideas?
You're about to meet a father who refused to give up, a man who defied the doctors and went looking for a miracle.
My generation remembers Jim Abrams quite well. He did some of our favorite movies like Airplane and Hot Shots and all of these funny movies in the 70s and 80s. Well, it wasn't very funny when Jim Abrams had a 16-month-old son who was having seizure after seizure after seizure. And he was going, because he was a big producer and he had the means, he went to the top doctors in the United States.
And at the time, Charlie was averaging about a dozen seizures a day. He was on 4 anti-epileptic medicines. If you have a critically ill kid, what would your choice be? Do you want to drug him? Do you want to cut his brain? Or do you want to change what he eats? And it just seems so obvious to me.
This is not to blame doctors. Doctors are spread really thin, and they have to try to do the best they can. But it was Jim who figured out on his own by going to a library in the hospital and just happened to open a book to a page that showed the ketogenic diet as being the best way to deal with seizures in infants.
The book claimed that experts here in Baltimore were perfecting something called the ketogenic diet, a diet consisting largely of something most doctors tell us to avoid.
I called Dr. Freeman from Johns Hopkins, told him about Charlie, and he said, send his medical records. We did, and he said, well, bring Charlie out to Hopkins and we'll try the diet. And we started the diet, and in 2 days, his seizures were gone.
2 days?
2 days.
Jim was angry and puzzled that none of the 6 doctors he went to for help ever mentioned the diet.
What has stopped Charlie's seizures has been in existence for 70 years. It's been sitting there. It was waiting for him.
You had some knowledge that this diet was probably working back at Johns Hopkins, and yet you dissuaded the Abrams from attempting it. How come?
Well, because I don't think we had exhausted all of the medical approaches yet. There were actually still other medications that we hadn't tried yet.
Dr. Freeman tells us that 50 to 70% of the patients that come through his doors and get put on the diet have success. Can you think of any drugs in these hard cases that have 50 to 70% success rates?
Probably not anything that comes up to that level.
In another month, Dr. Freeman weaned him off all 4 anti-epileptic medicines, and Charlie went from a prognosis of a lifetime of seizures and what they call progressive retardation to we got our son back, and his smile was back, and he was happy again, and our family could go on with life.
This is Charlie Abrams and his mom, Nancy. I've known him since birth. I've watched his delightful personality emerge through a normal first year. I witnessed his debilitating battle with seizures and medicines. I rejoiced with his family when the ketogenic diet stopped his epilepsy. And now I derive strength and joy like so many of his other friends as we watch him begin to develop again. It's too early to tell whether the 9 months of pummeling from seizures and medicines did any permanent damage to Charlie's brain. If he has anything to say in the matter, I know they won't. However, it's not too early to tell that had Charlie's parents been informed about the existence of the ketogenic diet when he first got sick, and about the success they've had with it at Johns Hopkins, a vast majority of Charlie's seizures would not have occurred, and most of his $100,000 worth of medical, surgical, and drug treatment would not have been necessary.
Even today, 1.5 out of every 10,000 people with epilepsy who would benefit from a ketogenic diet are using it today. Doctors are not taught diet therapy or even nutrition in medical school. They just simply aren't. Try an informal survey on your own. Next time you see a doctor, your doctor, anybody, any doctor, say, when you were in medical school, how long were you, how much time did you spend investigating and learning about nutrition and diet therapy?
I didn't really have much nutritional training like most doctors.
In 4 years of psychiatry training, we didn't talk about food once.
Extent of my training, I got nutrition. Let's see, let's talk about year 1, 2, 3, 4, then 4 years of residency, 0. 0. I got 0 in addiction too. 0 in nutrition, 0 in addiction. We were so damn busy taking care of illness, and trying to push that back and save life that trying to prevent illness was not really on our radar.
I feel anger. I'm pissed off. And again, I think that the reasons that the diet hasn't become more popular has nothing to do with efficacy at all. It has to do with revenue sources that are more lucrative. The ketogenic diet isn't that expensive. The problem is it doesn't generate revenue for the medical world. There are powerful forces at work in our medical system that have nothing to do with good health.
My patients have been getting fatter and sicker over the last few decades, and in particular, we're starting to see diabetes out of control, and that changes everything. I used to see the occasional person who needed diabetic foot ulcer management and needing an amputation, and it started becoming virtually weekly. When you come into a clinic and there's patients with, with rotting flesh, and it is rotting flesh, and it smells bad, it looks bad, and all you're doing is just trimming off a little bit of foot. It starts with a toe, starts with an ulcer, then it moves up the foot, and sometimes you get to a point after doing 2 or 3 operations, it's been going a couple of months, and then the decision is you've actually got to chop that leg off. There's something which really upsets me, and that's when you actually amputate someone's limb, there's a sound of actually dropping that leg into a bucket. I don't want anyone to hear that, that noise. It's just, it's just sickening. I started talking to my patients about reducing sugar, and the benefits were immediate.
Not only would the people's fatty liver disease get better, not only would all of their blood numbers get better, but in fact, he would not have to end up chopping off a foot or a leg.
I then went to the hospital dietitians and said, hang on, this is really exciting, this stuff about sugar. Started talking about it to the staff, and then I started implementing a sugar reduction for my patients, only to find out that I was starting to tread on some big toes. The dietitians then started kicking up a stink about that, involving their parent organisation, the Dietitians Association of Australia, who started becoming involved in pressuring the hospital into silencing me.
We received evidence in Sydney from a medical practitioner in Tasmania, Dr. Gary Fettke. He gave the evidence to the committee in the morning of our hearing in Sydney. 3 hours later, he received an official caution from Oprah.
The first time I heard the story, I just thought it was a joke.
The board's actual statement requires that doctors double-check that their personal beliefs don't compromise care, that they don't put their commercial interest in front of patients, and lastly, doctors should provide appropriate dietary advice.
Ultimately, the medical board made a ruling that I am now the only doctor, as far as we know in the world, to be banned from advising his patients to reduce their sugar and junk food intake. And if that sounds crazy, then that's what it is.
We recognise that the being subject to the notifications process for a practitioner can be an extraordinarily stressful thing, because there are pretty serious issues at stake ultimately in terms of their practice of their profession and
their reputation.
And their reputation. And despite the fact that we are not punitive in our focus, we are protective in our focus, so our mandate is a public protection focus, we understand and appreciate that it may not feel like that for the practitioner involved in the process.
For a long time, I couldn't actually work out why there was anything actually against what I was talking about. Everything about reducing sugar and carbohydrate is basic biochemistry. It's in the first 100 pages of textbooks. There's nothing extreme about it. Once you see the results of reducing sugar and carbs, particularly in diabetes, you can't unsee them.
At this point, I think there is active suppression of this science, and this has been going on since the 60s. One of the things that I found in my research, the biggest ever test of Ancel Keys' hypothesis was something called the Minnesota Coronary Survey. It was on more than 9,000 men and women in 5 Minnesota mental hospitals, which was a really well-controlled study because somebody in a hospital, you can control everything they're eating. They gave half the people what was considered the normal amount of saturated fat, regular milk, regular meat, cheese, butter, etc. The other half, they gave 9% saturated fat, so soy-filled milk, soy-filled cheese, soy-filled burgers. They found that the people on the vegetable oil, soy-filled diets there was no effect on cardiovascular mortality or total mortality. That study was not published for 16 years. One of the principal investigators, Ivan France, was asked by a journalist, "Why did you not publish the study?" He said, "Well, there was really nothing wrong with it. We were just so disappointed in the way it came out." Well, that's like, that's basically scientific fraud, not publishing your results.
I've started to ask the question, what got in the way? What's withholding the message? Well, there is a pharmaceutical and medical device industry that makes billions selling their products to doctors who have no interest in diet therapy. There is a sugar industry that adds sugar to all of our processed foods that has no interest in promoting a sugar-free diet. There is a cardiology community led by the American Heart Association that has been spreading misinformation about a high-fat diet based on flawed science for over 70 years.
Those diets have been used in children for many years who have epilepsy, and those children show definite cognitive dysfunction. Also, those diets contain
Which means they don't think as clearly.
That's
Those
right.
children are also children who have as many, they're intransigent childhood epilepsy. They have as many as 400 seizures a month. They're untreatable by drugs. They go on the diets, and the diets, I think it cures 33% of them, cures them.
These are epilepsy, and then they aren't able to think.
Today, Charlie is a elementary school teacher, at a certificate in early childhood education. He boxes, he plays piano, and we are beyond grateful every day for his outcome.
I'm not sure what would have become of me if my family hadn't found the ketogenic diet, but I doubt that today I would be an A student in high school with lots of friends. I doubt I would have been playing piano for the last 8 years, and I doubt I could hit an 8-iron 160 yards.
And they just couldn't accept that they were dealing with these intractable conditions. And not just pediatric epilepsy, but obesity is an intractable condition. Diabetes, type 2 diabetes is an intractable condition. Type 1 is, and here you have this diet that appears to put these conditions into remission. The establishment here, represented by our friends, is a little too dogmatic and that we may never know the truth unless we acknowledge that there is a counter theory that has never been tested, and that theory, more and more people are beginning to accept parts of the theory as being legitimate, and that it could answer a lot of problems, and it could even make it easier for Americans to lose weight.
People are able to reverse diabetes. People are able to lose weight sustainably. Most, if not all, cardiovascular risk factors are improved along the way on a lower carbohydrate diet. That diet ought to be at least considered.
If it turns out to be true, I'll be the first to change my mind, but show me the data.
Well, here's just one study that says that long-term ketosis reduces body weight, triglycerides, LDL, and blood glucose, and shows that it's safe to use a long-term ketogenic diet.
You can lose weight on a plant-based diet, you can lose weight on a ketogenic diet. But are you mortgaging your health when you do that? And the answer is yes. The ketogenic diet, when you look at the arteries of people or animals that go on a ketogenic diet, they tend to be more clogged, even though they may be losing.
Imagine someone who spent his whole career getting the wrong answer. Not only getting the wrong answer, getting a wrong answer that's dangerous, that actually may have killed tens of thousands of hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people prematurely. There's no way to tell. And these outsiders come along and say, you're wrong. Not only are you wrong, you're completely wrong, or not even wrong. It's so senseless what you've been doing, and you're killing people, and you have to switch. I don't think any human being, we're just not wired to be able to say, oh yeah, that's a good point. I get it. I see what you're saying, and I'm sorry. And if you're an institution like the American Heart Association, imagine the press release you would have to write. Dear American public, we're sorry if we killed prematurely your loved ones and your parents, and maybe we're killing you, but in retrospect, we shouldn't have given the advice we did.
You know, we think about corporations or our government, which is a corporation, and the first question is, do we blame them? Well, you can't hurt the government's feelings, you can't hurt corporations' feelings, because corporations and governments are not people. They're machines. They're just big, giant machines. And any person in that machine is just a cog, and there's no way to hurt anyone's feelings or to get on anyone's bad side. It's just a machine that keeps running.
Decisions of a nation and of a government that at one time could tolerate 3 or 4 weeks of study now demand almost instantaneous reaction.
The people of the United States recognize, one by one, thousand by thousand, million by million, that this is a problem whose solution is long overdue.
Long before Lyndon Johnson came into a position of power, our leaders were recommending great advances in the field of civil rights and great advances in the field of health and things of that nature. I just happen to be the catalyst. We're living in a fast age, and all of us are rather impatient.
I am proposing today a new national health strategy. It emphasizes keeping people well, not just making people well.
I do envision the day when we may use the private health insurance system to offer more middle-income families high-quality health services at prices they can afford, and shield them also from their catastrophic illnesses.
Today I'm proposing to the Congress a national health plan. This major initiative will meet the most urgent needs in health care of the American people.
Our administration will propose to Congress a comprehensive plan to cover catastrophic illnesses.
I am proud to have been part of an administration that passed the first catastrophic health bill.
Whatever form it takes, a catastrophic illness costs money.
There are some little known but very important provisions in this new balanced budget that will take us a tremendous step forward in our fight against diabetes. These investments total more than $2 billion over the next 5 years.
We must remember that the best healthcare decisions are not made by government and insurance companies, but by patients and their doctors.
Because you're eating healthy and you're out there active and you're playing sports and you're out in the playground and doing all those things, not only are you going to have a better life, but you're also helping to create a stronger, healthier America. And that saves us money. It means people are not sick as much. It means that our health care costs go down.
When you roll up at a McDonald's, what does Donald Trump order?
Fish Delight sometimes. The Big Macs are great. The Quarter Pounder with cheese. I mean, it's great stuff.
Do people at the windows be like, what?
I think all of those places, Burger King, McDonald's, I can live with them. I had the other night, I had Kentucky Fried Chicken. Not the worst thing in the world.
If you think it's up to government, you're wrong. If you think it's up to industry, you're wrong. It's up to you. And if you're going to make a change, if you're watching this, change right now, tonight. Don't wait until tomorrow. If it's a Friday night, don't say Monday you're going to start. Start now. There's no time better than right now to get your life in order. I've been doing a podcast with Anna Vocino for about 7 years.
When we first started the podcast, nobody was listening.
Someone's going, all right, I want to lose weight. Wait, that steak is 1,200 calories? This bowl of pasta is 500 calories less?
And as a woman, you're told, don't eat more than 1,200 calories a day if you want to lose weight. So you think, oh, I can't have that steak because that's my whole day. We started attracting the attention of people in the low-carb community, doctors, authors, like Gary Taubes, Nita Teicholz. It's important for us to have the experts on because we're like, see what that guy said.
Anna also, turns out, is a great cook.
As a person who works with food a lot, I get asked many questions about fake sweeteners or fake this or fake that, and I personally think it's going to have to go in an even more natural direction where we just have this return to just eating food in its most natural state. Vinny and I are very passionate about this topic. Let's say you watch this documentary, let's say you watch the others and you're like, this is it. I'm going to do this. I am going to give up the processed sugars and grains and I'm going to go for a high-fat, low-carb diet. And which you should do it. Try it. It can't hurt to not have sugars and grains. Like, just try it. When that happens and there's an adjustment phase, all of us in this country, myself included, have been in the diet mentality. If we can peel back that diet mentality, it would be amazing.